Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's that magic time, 9 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying their summit so far. I know I am. And today we're going to be talking about using PowerShell Core to automate application packaging, deployment, and updates with Habitat. So if you want anybody to help you come up with your titles for your talks, I do charge by the word. Just a little bit about myself. So I work for Chef Software. Chef actually develops Habitat. I'm a principal engineer on the Habitat team. My main job is to make sure that Habitat works on Windows. So Habitat is a cross-platform product. We work across Windows and Linux, all sorts of different runtimes. My key role is the Windows platform-specific coding of Habitat. I've also done a fair amount of open source contributions over the years. In fact, the last PowerShell Summit I was at was the first PowerShell Summit in 2013, where I talked about Pester, back when nobody heard about Pester, and I was pretty excited to see there's a few talks about Pester, and it's fairly ubiquitous in the PowerShell world, so that's pretty awesome. I did the mocking framework, at least the initial implementation of the mocking framework for Pester back in 2013, I did some work in the early days, or I guess mid-ish early days of Chocolatey, from which I created Box Starter. I don't actively maintain that anymore. I transferred that over to the Habitat team. I've done a fair amount of work in Vagrant, so if you use Vagrant, you've probably used some of my code. And then I implemented the PowerShell remoting protocol in Ruby, which is in the WinRM gem, which is used by a few projects here and there. So other than that, you can find me on Twitter and my blog as well. But let's get to it. So real quick, before I dive into the content, I just want to let everyone know. So I'm going to be going through a lot of content. I'm going to be going rather quickly. In case there's something that you wish I had gone into a little bit more in depth, or that you'd like to go into more in depth on your own, or just found it confusing, our website is habitat.sh, and there you'll find documentation, tutorials. In fact, a lot of the demos I'm going to be doing today, we have a tutorial that does most of that. So if you actually want to go hands-on and walk through that, you could do that there. We also have what we call our builder service, which is like an online hosted Habitat packaging build system that you can use, which now we have Windows packages that you can do up there rather recently. The application that we're going to be automating here, the Habitat integration code that we'll be looking at is on GitHub. So it'll be at this URL. I'll be posting these on the Slack, so you can check this out later. I'll do that sometime today. And then we're not going to be looking at this. We're going to be using the SQL Server Habitat package. In case you're interested in how that was packaged up and the Habitat hooks that were involved there, you're welcome to look at that. It's all open source, and this is the URL for that. So what is Habitat? So Habitat is automation in service of the application. So when a lot of us think about automation tools today, we naturally think of the configuration management space, which of course Chef, who produces Habitat, is very much in. So you've got your chefs, your puppets, your Ansibles. They're all about the end goal is making sure my server looks such and such a way that I can take my server from some unknown state to a desired state with the click of a button, or with a script. And Habitat has a very similar end goal to that, but instead of the point of focus being an individual server, its point of focus is being an application. And what I mean by that is not even necessarily so in our case, we're going to be looking at an ASP.NET application. That ASP.NET application is really, in order for it to work, it's a collection of various applications. So it's an ASP.NET application here. It might be a SQL Server database over here. Maybe it's some RabbitMQ over here and some Memcached over here. It needs all of those things to create our application, to create the user experience that we want to provide to our users. So Habitat is, how do I automate, lighting that stuff up in all these different places, getting them all talking to each other, installed and updated, monitoring them. So Habitat is really about that, and what that really includes is what you get with Habitat is packaging. So Habitat will package your application. You will install that package. So it's about making sure that application is installed, is configured correctly. So I might have different environments for my application, dev, staging, production, whatnot. I might need different configuration across those environments, different secrets, different file paths, and Habitat helps manage that. Health monitoring, making sure my application is behaving as I expect it to, and updates. So especially if we maintain our own applications, if we build them in-house, and even if we don't, we want to be able to update them rather seamlessly and automate the process of those updates. So real quick, in order to provide all that functionality, Habitat covers a pretty broad surface area. And so the components that are wrapped up in Habitat, we're about to look at each of those components, but just to name them. So we've got a build studio. So Habitat provides a component where you can do your packaging and build your packages and test your packages. What we call a depot, which is, you can kind of think of that as like a PowerShell gallery. It's essentially a package repository, a place where once you've created your package, where do you put those packages, and from where will my application servers consume those packages? A supervisor, so that's really kind of the runtime agent of Habitat, super small, that runs on the application server. It's going to pull down your packages from the depot. It's going to load your application. It's going to know how to run your application. And then exporters. Exporters is kind of one of those things it's like an optional component. We're going to be looking at an exporter that I think is interesting. We're going to be looking at our Docker exporter. So because Habitat knows so much about your application, it's super simple for Habitat to export, to use its Docker exporter to take your application and just make a Docker image out of it with a single command line. We'll be looking at that. And so finally, and what I think makes this rather pertinent to this summit, is that the user interface for us, application developers, application operators, the people that are invested in the care and feeding of these applications, the way that we interact with Habitat to do this automation is PowerShell Core to be exact. We love PowerShell Core because we can package it, we can bundle it. We know exactly what version of PowerShell you're running to use our automation, so we don't have to have all this crazy logic of, well, gee, are you on this version of Windows? Are you using this version of PowerShell? It makes some of that super easy. We've had to submit a couple of PRs into PowerShell Core, and so that's been awesome too, to be able to do that. We can build PowerShell Core on our own, so that's the key API into Habitat and what we'll be looking at. So that's enough of slides. Let's go right into it. So let me just, I meant to bring my own mouse, but alas, did not. There we go. Okay. So, so this right here, what we're looking at here, this is what's called a plan. This is basically the basic building block of a Habitat package. There is no Habitat automation without this plan. The concept of a plan is really an entire directory structure that you see over here, where you've got a few files, a couple directories, but at a minimum, every single Habitat package is going to be composed with a plan. You can kind of think of a plan as it's like a combination of a NuSpec file. If you're familiar with NuGet, for example, or Chocolatey, like a combination of a NuSpec file and a Chocolatey install file. In a way, it's a little bit more than that, but just to try and give you something to compare it to. But it's in PowerShell, so this is a plan.ps1. Like I said, Habitat is cross-platform, and if I was building Linux applications, I would be using Bash. But we're going to be working in Windows, so we're going to be working with PowerShell. Basically, the design principle was we want to be using technologies that those who are on the platform that you're targeting are already familiar with. So, for example, we don't want you to have to learn Ruby, which is often the case with Chef, to have to interact with Habitat. If you're working in Windows, chances are much greater that you know PowerShell than Ruby, and so hopefully this is something that you would already feel comfortable with. So, in this plan, basically what we're doing is we're telling Habitat some basic information about our application, and then as we get a little further down below where we can't see here, we're going to tell Habitat some things about like how to build our application that Habitat doesn't know on its own. So some of this stuff is rather uninteresting. But I've got application name. So Contoso University, in the Microsoft world, Contoso seems to run the world, but this is actually, so the source code for this application we're going to download from Microsoft. So one thing I want to get across is I didn't have to rewrite this application to work with Habitat. Like, this source code is coming straight from Microsoft. This is the Entity Framework sample application. And you got versioning, origin. This is kind of like an organizational thing. You can think of it like a GitHub organization. But things get more interesting down here when we start talking about dependencies. So in Habitat, you can separate out build time dependencies from runtime dependencies. Because as we all know, we may need different things. Well, we will need different things to run our application than we would to build our application. So this is an ASP.NET full framework application. So we're going to need ASP.NET 4.5 at least for this particular application. We're going to need IIS enabled. So the package depths these are our runtime, what we need to run the application. We're going to need ASP.NET. We'll take a little bit of a look at this a little later, but we're going to need DSC. So we distribute a package on our own called DSC-Core that makes it a little easier to apply a DSC configuration within a PowerShell Core environment. There's a little bit of, if you want to apply a DSC configuration inside of PowerShell Core, there's some extra plumbing with sim methods and stuff that you have to do. This kind of abstracts that away from you. But to build this application, I don't need IIS. I don't even really need the .NET 4.5 runtime. I need the .NET 4.5 reference assemblies, which I'll get in this dev pack. I need NuGet. I need things like MS-Build and various MS-Build targets, which I'll get in these visual build tools. So this is what will get pulled down into my build environment. But come runtime, my supervisors running on my application servers, they're not going to care about this. They're not going to need it. They're not going to pull it down. One other thing I want to talk about is binds. So binds are, it's almost like dependencies in the sense that, so in our case, our ASP.NET application, it needs a database to really be meaningful. So it's got a home page that's static, so that I could actually run this ASP.NET application without a database. So it's not like a runtime that it needs on that same server. But in order for it to do what it was meant to do, to provide listings of students and class schedules and whatnot, it needs to interact with a database. And so Habitat has this notion of binds, which is basically the facility by which applications running inside of a Habitat network. So my Habitat network may comprise several different servers, each running their own supervisor, and they can talk to each other and tell each other about what services they're running. And so what this does is this facilitates how applications find each other and how they connect up with one another. So what this is saying is, I expect there to be this thing. I'm going to call it a database. We call this our binding alias. It's the thing that's on the left-hand side of the equal sign here. And I'm basically specifying what my requirements are for this database. My requirements is that it's going to expose to me these three properties. It needs to expose to me a username, password, and port, because in this case, that's how I'm going to create a ASP.NET connection string to that SQL Server database. And So this is we have required binds and we have optional binds. I'm not going to get too much into the details. So I absolutely, positively need a SQL Server that's my required bind. So if this isn't present at runtime when I go to launch my application, Habitat's going to basically hold my application in a holding pattern until that becomes present in my environment. Now, I also do have an optional bind that we're not going to use here. And I have another demo that I do with where Habitat basically gets SQL Server HA up and running. And so in that case, optionally, I might have SQL Server HA, in which case I might want a cluster name to bind to. So that goes over kind of the bulk of the how do I describe my application to Habitat. Next is, so how do I build my application? Now first of all, I don't need, in this case, I am going to go ahead and build this application from source, which is cool, but I don't need to. Maybe I'm in an organization where there's another group, they've got their whole build thing, they don't want to mess with it, and they just want to give me a zip file. Maybe it's a COTS application. Like, for example, the SQL Server plan, we don't build SQL Server. That's not even open source. And so you can certainly create these plans where you can consume something that's already built. But here we're going to build it. So the Habitat build system exposes these functions to us that are optional. There's several functions. We're going to implement 2 of them. And basically, this is our way of telling Habitat that doesn't know anything about .NET. Habitat doesn't know anything about Ruby, Go, whatever. This is our opportunity because we own this application, so we know how to build it. We probably have this code sitting on our Jenkins or our VSTS servers somewhere anyways. And so here I'm going to use things like NuGet and msbuild to build my application. And because I've declared runtime dependencies on NuGet and Visual Build Tools, these things are automatically on my path. So I know that I have them on my build, in my build environment. I know I can just call these commands and they'll be there. So that's going to build, that's going to take my C# source code and it's going to build me some artifacts. It's going to build me a DLL, basically. And so lastly, I'm going to implement this invoke-install function. And what the invoke-install function is basically going to do is it's going to tell Habitat what to actually put in the package. All the files that basically IIS and ASP.NET Runtime is going to need to run my application. So in this case, I'm going to use msbuild to do that. I'm going to use the WebPublish Target, which those of you familiar with msbuild may know, that basically will look at your CSproj file and it'll take all the files that is expected to be present in this particular ASP.NET application, and it'll copy them. It'll lay all those bits down in this location. And this package prefix variable, this is defined by the Habitat build system, and basically anything that I put inside a package prefix is going to get included inside of my my Habitat package. So then I'm gonna do a little bit of extra stuff here. I'm going to yank out the web config because, well, I said that we're getting all of our source code from Microsoft. There is just a little bit of templating that I'm going to throw into my web config where I'll allow Habitat to inject in this connection data that it'll get at runtime. So I'm going to throw out the web config that I'm getting from Microsoft and I'm going to bring my own web config. We don't have time to look at that in detail. But again, this is all online. You can take a look at that at your leisure. And then I'm going to do a little hack here. If we have time, we're going to update this application. And in order for that to be meaningful, we're going to want to see the version of that application on the home page. So I'm just doing a basic find and replace of this welcome string, welcome to Contosa University. I'm replacing it with that followed by our package version. So when we get an update, we can say, oh, look, the version has incremented. So this is how we tell Habitat how to package our software. So that's great. Let's do it. Let's go to this special environment. So Habitat provides what we call a build studio. And so there's different flavors. This is the Docker flavor. So what I'm in right now, I'm in a Windows Docker container. that is essentially just a basic Windows Server Core base image with the running Habitat Supervisor, so I can test this application. It's got the Habitat build system, so I can build it. And when I entered into this studio, which I did prior to the talk because I did some things to make some of this stuff go a little bit more quickly, it mounts the directory from which I entered into it. So when I ran hab studio enter, which is the command to get to where I am now, I was sitting inside of basically this directory over here. So that mounts everything into this source directory. So if I just do a dir here, I see basically the exact same stuff that I see in my editor. So so I'm going to run build. Whoops, build is not spelled with a 7. And period, just tell it the current directory that I am is its point of reference. So it is now, that red, by the way, is, I am connected to the internet, aren't I? Yeah. Now it's, so if any of you that have done, MS builds are probably recognizing, oh, that looks like MS build, because it is MS build. So it's actually building my my ASP.NET application, used NuGet to pull down all of its dependencies. It went off to the Habitat depot to look for my runtime dependencies, and so I built this prior to this talk so that it wouldn't have to pull all that stuff down from scratch. It's already cached. And so now it's generated this file, this heart file. So the heart file is basically the Habitat artifact, our build artifact. And it's also installed it. So in this studio environment that I'm in, it's installed this heart file. So now I can actually run it in my supervisor. So the reason why we have this special studio environment, there's a few reasons. One is it's a super minimal environment. And what this does is it basically enforces an environment where I can have a higher guarantee that there's no dependencies that are going to bleed into this environment that might not be present in another environment. So because this is such a minimal environment, I know that whatever I need to successfully build this had better well be specified in my runtime dependencies. And if it breaks, then I did something wrong there. And if it works, this should work in any modern Windows operating system. And once I'm done, I can throw this thing away. So that's the great thing about the Docker Studio. I can just throw it away, and everything's gone. And there was no state on my personal system that's been affected by this. So now that I've got this thing built, let's see if it works. So I already, prior to this talk, I already started up SQL Server inside of this environment. So I could do a hab service status, and this will tell me what my supervisor is running. So I can see, okay, it's already running SQL Server. Cool. Let's copy that. And now I'm going to say hab service load. Mrock, that's my private origin. Contosa University. And I'm going to use this bind argument. So as we talked about before, I need to bind to a database, and I specified that in my plan. I've said I've got this thing called a database I need to bind to. So I'm going to take that string, I'm going to type it database, followed by a colon. So now it needs, okay, great, well, I need a database. What's going to satisfy these requirements? What's going to have a username, password, and port that it can expose to me? Well, SQL Server.default is. So I am going to, oops. I thought I copied that. Okay, I guess I'll just type it out like the old-fashioned SQL. Okay, there we go. So that's basically a Habitat Supervisor saying, thank you very much. I've loaded your application. Best of luck to you. But so it doesn't really give me a whole lot of information. So one of the commandlets that we expose in the studio environment is a way to basically tail the supervisor log. So I can see what is the supervisor doing. So I'm going to say get supervisor log, and that is going to tell me what it is up to. So so now it is. It's basically it's compiling some DSC. So that was something we kind of alluded to earlier, but we didn't get into. While it's doing that, let's look at that. So over in this config directory, so Habitat has this notion, has these directories. There's two directories called a config directory and a hooks directory, and we can put extra stuff in there. So one of the things that we have is this website.ps1, and so those that are familiar with DSC can look in this and see, oh, this looks like a DSC configuration. This is going to do things like it's going to configure our web application pools, it's going to configure our website, it's going to configure a web application folder. One thing that might look kind of funky here are these double curly braces, because this is not like any PowerShell syntax that I'm familiar with, and that's because, so these are what we call templates, and Habitat uses the handlebars templating syntax. It's a popular templating style, and basically at runtime, before this ever gets to the DSC LCM, basically before it ever gets to PowerShell, everything that we see here in these double brackets is going to be injected with the correct value at runtime. So I can configure an application pool name, I can configure a port, which begs the question, where are those coming from? Does Habitat just kind of know what application names and ports are? Well, no. So, I might have across my different environments, production staging, I might have different ports that I want to run my application on. I might have different names that I want to give to my application. And there's different facilities by which Habitat allows me to kind of, at runtime, tell Habitat, hey, these are my configuration values that I want you to use. But at a minimum, what everyone is typically going to do and include in their package is this file called default.toml. And so you can kind of think of these as safe defaults. So if I don't tell the supervisor anything, it's going to use these defaults, it's going to use these values for those configuration settings. So I'm going to, and this is what we're going to use. So I'm going to be on port 8099. I'm going to be, hab pool. So all that stuff will get resolved to those values. And so then the next question is, well, oh, that is not the editor I want to be in. The next question is, well, how does Habitat even invoke this configuration file? So that is where we get into hooks. So hooks are PowerShell scripts that we write that tell the supervisor how to do certain things at certain times. So there are a variety of different hooks that that Habitat exposes to us. We're going to use a few of them. They're all optional, and basically the Habitat supervisor will call these at different points of an application's runtime. And so, for example, the install hook, the Habitat supervisor will call this the very first time it loads an application. And then as long as that was successful, it'll never call it again. So here we're doing things like we're making sure the NuGet package provider, because we're doing DSC stuff, so we're making sure the NuGet package provider is there. We're making sure the X Web Administration DSC module is there. Once that stuff's installed, I'm never going to have to deal with it again. Now, I might be paranoid and worried that somebody's going to wipe that off the machine, in which case I could put it in my init hook, which gets called every single time Habitat loads my application. That's a perfectly fine thing to do, but things move along a little bit more quickly if we don't do that every single time. The run hook, so how does Habitat even know how to start my ASP.NET application? So like, if this was a Node or even if this was a .NET Core application, I would tell Habitat to just call the .NET executable to run my application, and it would just start that process that would hold open, and that's I would do that inside of this run hook. Now, full framework applications, as we know, IIS basically totally takes over there. So it's really a matter of making sure that all the IIS primitives are set up and configured and pointing to the right place. So that's where this DSC comes in. We have to make sure that those application pools are started, that they're pointing to our source code. and which, by the way, here in the physical path, we do that. So the Habitat at runtime, this package object is provided to us, and so this is going to tell us where Habitat put our application. But basically these, so if you remember, we took a runtime dependency on this DSC-core package. So here's another, more double curly braces, and this is a handlebars function that Habitat exposes to us that'll basically point to the path where this package is on disk. And I just do an import dash module on where I know the PSD1 file to be. So once I do that, I have access to this function. So that exports this function start-dsc core, which takes two arguments. It takes the file where that DSC configuration exists. Again, we have access at runtime to this Habitat value called ServiceConfigPath, which will point to the path of where this config directory exists at runtime and where all those values were, all those templated values are resolved to. And it takes the name of the configuration. So if we were to look at our configuration file, we'll see that that is the name. So that will actually apply that DSC configuration. So if we go back here to our supervisor log, we can see, okay, it applied it, it's running. So right now, I should be in a state where I can test and make sure that this is working. So let's do this. I'm going to Control-C out of this log. I'm just going to do an IP config to get the IP address of this container. Copy that. Oh, did I get it? And go to my browser. So here I'm pointed to 8099, HabApp, that's the name of my application folder, and here we are. So things work. So that's great. This is, but like I said, this is a static page. Like, did the connection to the database work? I don't know. Let's see. Let's go to students. I think I'm going to see an empty list. I think this database is empty. I don't think in previous run-throughs I've added any values. Maybe I have. But even if this doesn't work, and oftentimes this is an entity framework sample app. The very first time it hits this page, it has to actually create the database. Okay, cool. So even though this is an empty list, if it couldn't have hit the database, I would have gotten a yellow screen of death, basically, that right here. It would have said, sorry, I can't even show you this page. So great. So I'm now in my supervisor, in my studio. Things are running. Let's take this to the next step. So let's take this out of my little dev. I just wanted to show kind of the development workflow. But now let's bring these things to production and let's get really fancy and let's be unlike any ASP.NET production team that I know of and actually run our production in Docker containers. So in order to do this, I need to export my Habitat services to a Docker image. And I need to do that both for SQL Server. I basically need to do that for all my Habitat services that I have running. In this case, I have two services running. Service. So I've got these two services running. I need to create Docker containers for images for these. I've already done that because it takes a little time. Because what happens is, let me just go back to my slides real quick. I have a slide that basically just shows the command. It's not, so it's basically, can you see that? Yeah, kind of. It's that simple. So hab package Docker, hab package export Docker, you give it that path to your heart file. And so what it does is it grabs your package, and the first thing it does is just lays down a base image of Windows Server Core. It adds the Habitat Supervisor on top of that. And then it grabs, it puts in your application and all the bits that are included in your application, along with all of its runtime dependencies and their runtime dependencies, so the entire runtime dependency tree. And it runs all of the install hooks. So at build time, it runs all of the install hooks of every single dependency and of itself. So for example, here, we've taken runtime dependencies, for example, on web server roles. So during the image build, it's going to do things like enable these, enable about a handful of Windows features that takes, a good 5 minutes at least probably. But what that means is once it's baked your image, so once it pops out that image, it's good to go. It's got all these features enabled. On the SQL Server end, when we exported that one, it's got SQL Server installed and ready to run. So things go pretty quickly. So I've already created the packages, and I've already started the SQL Server package. So if you look here, so in this console, I've done already a Docker run -d. So I'm running it in detached mode, it's just running in the background. I got its IP address because I'm going to need that. And now I'm going to start up my application. I'll go back in history. And so what I'm going to do, let's see, 200.164. So I'm just going to say Docker run. So I'm just using Docker, the Docker command line. So Docker run -it. So I do want to see this interactively come to this console. When Habitat exports the image, it gives the image name of the Habitat origin / application name. So that's mrock / Contoso University. And then everything I add after that is just going to get forwarded to the supervisor running inside of that container. So we've already seen this bind argument. This is going to tell us that we want to bind to a database that in this case is not running in the same supervisor. So this is running in another container in a different supervisor. So I have to use this peer argument that basically I give it the IP address of that other container, and it's going to be able to peer up with that other supervisor and share configuration data so that now this application will be able to see all that SQL Server configuration information. So let me actually start that because I'm on Windows 10 and it takes a few seconds to actually start up the container. Let me just point out this last argument, strategy. So strategy is an update strategy. So I'm telling it that if you see an update, update yourself at once. We have like 3 different strategies. The default is none. Don't update yourself at all. That's the safest way. It's just don't update. And then we have a rolling strategy. So if this was like more of a robust production environment and I had 3 application tiers, like if I had 3 containers, I don't want all those containers going down at the same time, right? So I would roll the updates across them. So we're going to go simple here. We're just going to update it once. So now it's starting that and it's going to do some of the same DSC stuff that we saw before. So while it's doing that, let's get ourselves in a position where we can do that update. So I'm going to go over here, and the first thing I need to do is I need to take that application I built, and I need to upload it to our depot. So let me find, where'd you go? The artifact. Now, one thing with Docker is sometimes the output gets like super weirded out here. So I'm going to just do this manually. So let's see, hab, package, upload. I just happen to know that they go here, card, results, W. You can't shift tab, and the Docker TTY can just does super weird things sometimes in a console. In fact, actually, you know what? This might be easier if I just do this, and I'm just going to build this again, and then I'll just get that output for me. And I have a feeling, so this might fail because that red stuff basically it flew by, but I think that in the process of I think that maybe this studio might not have a great connection with the outside world, which it's going to need in order for this to happen the way we want it to happen. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to upload this artifact to the depot. So okay, so here we go. So artifact. Copy this guy. Yes. Yeah, like what the hell? Okay, there we go. And then, whoops. Okay. Oops. Oh, yes. The little things. Okay, so this is the moment of truth. And the truth isn't looking too good here. So I should be seeing like network activity. That's cool. No biggie. So at any rate, had that worked, what I would expect to have seen, so I can at least do this. So let's go back to my, it's still waiting for that dang LCM. I swear to you, this worked like the 20 times I tried this before this, but the LCM is busy sometimes. What can I say? You know, I guess the LCM has got better things to do. So I would find that the IP address that this was working here, and I would go, you know, I would basically swap out. So one way to find that IP address. So one thing I wanted to show, I've got a couple minutes here. So here, this is the IP address of the SQL Server supervisor. And one thing that the supervisor does is it exposes an HTTP gateway where I can get JSON data about my environment. And so it has several different endpoints. This is a census endpoint, and I'm going to refresh this. So right now, I just see, this is brought up from a while ago, so I just see SQL Server. If I refresh this, if that peering worked, what I should see, okay, so it sees Contoso University, and Contoso University is running on this IP address. Oh, okay, that's super weird. Well, what do you know? It's ready now. So we'll plug in our IP address. I've seen that happen before, but not in this type of environment. And yay, so here we are running in a container. Our version is a little different because this is the last version that, so it did update itself with what was in the depot. So this container can talk to it. For whatever reason, my studio container can't talk to the outside world. We don't really have time to futz with that. But if that had worked, it would update itself. We would refresh this, and this would go to like 2.14 was what we built. But at any rate, that's pretty much all the content I got. Most of the time we have, we've got a few minutes for questions. And by the way, if anybody has a questions, I have these. Now I forget what they're called. This is for the iron scripting. I guess there's a secret covert group. So anyway, any questions? Great. Well, thank you so much for listening. If you want to install Habitat, use Chocolatey. Choco install Habitat. Check out our website, habitat.sh. And again, thanks a lot. And I'll just, I've got a few more of these stickers. I'll put them right here if anybody wants them.